Let us begin by addressing something foundational. Masturbation, often dismissed as harmless or even natural, holds far more psychological and spiritual weight than most people care to admit. To understand why it can be a threat to your spiritual life, we must go beyond the superficial moral arguments and enter a deeper, more honest dialogue with the psyche itself. Carl Jung wrote that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's precisely where this conversation begins. The act of masturbation is not inherently evil, but it is rarely just about physical release. More often, it is a symbolic behavior, an emotional reflex born out of an unspoken internal need. When performed compulsively or used as an emotional escape, it becomes a ritual of self-soothing that bypasses growth, intimacy, and the soul's longing for higher union. At its core, masturbation isolates the sexual instinct from its archetypal function, relationship, union, generativity. It becomes a self-contained loop, erotic energy turned inward, disconnected from communion. What we are left with is not fulfillment, but a hollow cycle of tension and release, craving and shame. The soul, instead of expanding toward the transcendent or the other, collapses inward on itself. In Jungian terms, libido, the life energy, is being drained into a repetitive self-objectification rather than transformed into love, creation, or spiritual insight. Now, understand this clearly: the human sexual drive is not the enemy. It is a divine force, a carrier of eros, of vitality. But when misused, especially in secretive, compulsive forms, it becomes fragmented. It divides us internally. It generates guilt, yes, but more dangerously, it splits the psyche. One part of you indulges, another condemns. This inner war generates spiritual fatigue. Over time, this fatigue is misread as spiritual dryness, distance from God, or loss of purpose. And this is where the real damage begins. We begin to spiritually numb. We stop feeling God not because He has withdrawn, but because we've dulled the inner faculty that perceives Him. Our conscience, our intuition, our emotional responsiveness. Just as the body can be desensitized through overstimulation, so too can the soul. The spiritual life depends on sensitivity, on presence, on attentiveness. Chronic masturbation compromises that. It puts your will on autopilot. You become a passenger in your own desire, no longer steering, just reacting. So the issue here is not merely about morality, but about mastery, about becoming whole. When masturbation becomes habitual, it's not simply a bad habit. It's a symptom of a larger inner disorder, a misalignment of energy, a cry for connection, an evasion of truth. To ignore this is to remain enslaved to shadow, never integrating the part of us that is hungry for more than momentary pleasure. If we are to grow spiritually, we must reclaim our inner authority over our instincts, not by repression, but by redirection. The goal is not to shut down desire, but to elevate it. And so I leave you with this. What if the very energy you waste in secrecy was meant to build your soul into something sacred, visible, and unshakable? If we want to free ourselves from compulsive behaviors like masturbation, we cannot begin with the behavior itself. That's the surface, the symptom. The real transformation begins much deeper, in the roots of the psyche, where unconscious motivations drive conscious action. Unless we are willing to ask why the urge arises, we remain prisoners to it, treating the smoke while ignoring the fire. Every compulsion hides a story, and that story is often woven from early experiences, unmet emotional needs, unresolved conflicts, and patterns buried so deep they feel like personality rather than pain. Masturbation, particularly when habitual, is rarely just about physical need. It's often an attempt to soothe something more complex, an ache, a fear, a longing that hasn't yet found a voice. Carl Jung would say that when the libido is blocked from flowing in its natural direction toward love, creativity, connection, it turns back inward and becomes neurotic. That is what we see here, sexual energy turned in on itself, seeking comfort in solitude, often in secrecy, disconnected from purpose. Think about this. When do the urges hit hardest? Late at night, when you're alone, after rejection, during stress, in the absence of connection or mission. These are not coincidences. They are clues. The body is trying to express something the soul hasn't yet named, so the first task is to become an honest observer of your inner world. Not a judge, an observer. What is the emotional climate surrounding your urges? Is it anxiety, boredom, shame, loneliness? Sexual energy always seeks release, but what it really seeks is union, and if that union is not possible with another or with the divine, it will find a counterfeit version of itself in the quick fix of self-gratification. This is why behavior-based solutions, like filters or cold showers, so often fail. They treat the external, not the internal. If you don't heal the inner void, the outer behavior will simply find another form. Or worse, it will intensify, because the psyche will not be denied forever. It will cry out through dreams, anxiety, depression, or addiction until you finally turn and listen. Understanding your root motivations isn't about self-blame. It's about reclaiming authorship of your inner narrative. Maybe you were never taught how to sit with discomfort. Maybe you learned early on that pleasure was the only reliable escape from pain. That's not your fault, but staying there is a choice. And healing begins the moment you admit that the urge isn't your enemy. It's a messenger. So ask yourself, next time the compulsion arises, what am I actually seeking right now? Is it love, connection, meaning, control? The more clearly you can name that hidden need, the less power the habit will have over you. Because in truth, we are not slaves to our desires. We are slaves only to our unwillingness to understand them. Here's the thought I leave you with. You don't overcome the darkness by fighting it. You overcome it by turning on the light of conscious awareness. Once we've begun to understand the deeper psychological roots of the compulsion, the loneliness, the fear, the longing, we're no longer just reacting. We're beginning to respond with consciousness. But insight alone is not enough. Awareness must be followed by intentional practice. Otherwise, the insight fades and the old instincts reassert themselves. The psyche, much like the body, resists transformation without structure. This is where discipline enters, not as a form of repression, but as a conscious channel for redirection. Discipline is the scaffolding that supports the soul's ascent. There are 3 practices I call essential here. They are not secrets in the mystical sense, but they remain secret to most simply because they are not consistently lived. The first is devotional discipline. This doesn't mean mechanical religiosity. I'm speaking of conscious communion with the transcendent. Daily prayer, meditation, journaling, immersion in sacred text, not to earn favor, but to return your attention to the higher order you belong to. The more often you align your mind with that which is eternal, the less room there is for compulsive escape. You don't fight the urge by gritting your teeth. You dissolve it by shifting your gaze to something greater. The second is purposeful living. Compulsion thrives in the absence of direction. When you wake without a sense of calling, when your hours are filled with distraction rather than devotion, you become easy prey for instinct. But a man or woman who is anchored in purpose doesn't have time to be consumed by trivial urges. This is why sexual energy, when not misused, can become creative energy. What could you build if you weren't bleeding energy into secrecy and shame? A business, a song, a community. a family. The very same fire that fuels lust can be transmuted into leadership, love, and legacy. The soul doesn't want less intensity, it wants intensity with meaning. Third, and often most overlooked, is accountability. The ego resists this fiercely. It wants to believe it can conquer addiction alone. But addiction grows in isolation. It feeds off secrecy. When you bring your struggle into the light, whether through a trusted friend, mentor, or spiritual guide, you weaken its grip. Jung said that the possession of secrets acts like a psychic poison. To be seen is to be freed, but it requires humility. You must trade your pride for your freedom. In doing so, you open the door not just to support, but to transformation. None of these practices are instant. They are a path, a reordering of the self. But when applied together, they create a container strong enough to hold the full force of your desire and direct it towards something worthy. They don't kill the urge, they evolve it. Because the goal here is not abstinence for its own sake, but integration, to become a person whose desires serve the soul rather than sabotage it. So, I leave you with this. What if your self-mastery became your act of worship? What if discipline wasn't the cage but the key? The human mind does not exist in a vacuum. It is porous, constantly shaped by what we see, hear, touch, and consume. We often think of willpower as the sole engine of change. But the environment we live in is the fuel. And when it comes to breaking free from compulsive sexual habits, especially something as insidious as chronic masturbation, the environment is not a minor detail. It is central. You cannot plant a seed in poisoned soil and expect it to thrive. The same principle applies to the psyche. We guard what we value. And if we value our spiritual clarity, our inner authority, we must become fiercely protective of what enters our mind. Most people underestimate how easily overstimulation can bypass the conscious mind and trigger deep instincts. One sexually charged image, just a few seconds of exposure, can awaken dormant urges that then spiral into hours or days of internal struggle. It's not weakness, it's biology. The sexual instinct is one of the most potent energies in the human system. Jung would describe it as archetypal. It connects to the core of life itself, which is exactly why it must be stewarded with reverence, not treated as entertainment. Look at your digital life. What are you exposing your psyche to? Social media, film, music, and advertising today are saturated with subliminal erotic messaging. You may think you're just scrolling, but your unconscious is absorbing symbols, associations, images, all of which shape your desire, and desire, when stirred without direction, demands satisfaction. You may begin the day intending purity, but by nightfall, the accumulation of stimuli has already weakened your resolve. This is not moralism, it is mechanism. To break this cycle, you must create psychic boundaries. Clean your environment like you would clean a sacred space. Filter what you watch. Be intentional with what you listen to. Reorganize your daily habits so you aren't constantly walking through psychological minefields. It's not about being paranoid or prudish. It's about being awake. Every input you allow shapes the output of your inner life. You cannot expect spiritual clarity while feeding the mind a steady diet of chaos. But the external environment is only half the equation. The inner landscape must be guarded too. What thoughts are you entertaining? What fantasies do you indulge when no one is watching? Thought is rehearsal for action, and repetitive thought patterns, especially those laced with lust or escapism, carve deep grooves in the brain and the soul. To guard the mind is to become conscious of these patterns and to interrupt them before they become embodiment. This is not about fear, it is about freedom. Guarding your environment doesn't mean hiding from the world. It means entering the world with sovereignty. It is the act of choosing what shapes you, instead of passively being shaped. So I leave you with this: your mind is a temple or a trap, depending on what you allow to dwell within it. Choose what enters, and you choose who you become. Even with structure, intention, and environmental awareness, one truth still remains: you will fail sometimes. You will slip, relapse, regress. And when you do, the real battle begins, not against the behavior itself, but against the shame that follows. Shame is one of the most dangerous forces in the spiritual life. It masquerades as conviction but acts as corrosion, eating away at your sense of worth, your hope, your identity. Left unchecked, it does not lead to repentance. It leads to retreat. Many people imagine that their journey to freedom must be linear, clean, almost heroic, but the psyche doesn't work that way. Transformation, as Jung observed, is a spiral filled with detours, regressions, and even contradictions. We meet the same patterns again and again, not because we are weak, but because the soul deepens through repetition. The goal is not to emerge flawless, but to become whole, to integrate the shadow, to reconcile with our own complexity, to walk in truth without losing compassion for ourselves. This is why grace is not just a theological concept, it is a psychological necessity. Without grace, the self splits, one part striving for perfection, the other suffocating under the weight of inadequacy. But when grace is present, something remarkable happens. We remain connected to our core, even in failure. We don't have to hide. We don't have to pretend. We can fall without falling apart. Yet grace alone is not passive indulgence. It must be paired with responsibility. The spiritual path demands that we hold two truths at once. I am not condemned by my failure, and I am not excused from my calling. That tension, that paradox, is where growth occurs. You fall, you rise, you reflect, you move forward. You don't start over. You continue wiser. The danger in habitual sin like masturbation is not just the act, but the story we tell ourselves about the act. I'm too far gone. I'll never change. God must be distant. These are not facts. They are mental constructions, false narratives that sever us from the possibility of redemption. Jung insisted that healing begins when we make the unconscious conscious. That includes the hidden narratives of self-rejection. You must become aware of them, and then courageously rewrite them. Every step forward matters, no matter how small. Every temptation resisted, every urge redirected, every moment of awareness gained. It all counts. Healing is not a single decision, but a series of micro-choices made in quiet, often unnoticed moments. But each one rewires the brain, reorders the heart, and restores your connection to what is sacred. So if you stumble, begin again, not from shame but from vision. Not because you hate your weakness, but because you love your calling more. I'll end with this. Falling is not the end of your journey, it's part of your awakening. What defines you is not how often you fall, but how faithfully you rise.